So hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. I'm Ben Speggen and I'm the Vice President of the Jefferson and I'm a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. Joining me in conversation is Reverend Jeffrey Brown. Now, Reverend Brown was one of the key architects behind the Boston Miracle, which saw the violent crime rate amongst youth plummet nearly 80% in less than a decade. Today, he works with faith groups, cities, governments, and police to stop gang violence as the president of RECAP, Rebuilding Every Community Around Peace, and is a co-founder of My City at Peace. Now, you might recognize Reverend Brown from from the TED stage, where his TED Talk has notched more than 1.1 million views to date, or from behind the microphone for the podcast he hosted, The Courage to Listen. You might also recognize him from his appearance in Erie at the Global Summit stage for Global Summit VIII at the Jefferson. Today, we're here to talk about the transformational impact his work has had, racism in America, what it means today, and how the country is moving forward, the Black Lives Matter movement, and more. Since this program is first airing live on the Jefferson's Facebook page, we'll work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you do have a question, just leave it in the comment section below. If you are watching a later broadcast of this event, please do feel free to send us questions and we'll do our best to get them along to Reverend Brown. And of course, for more information about upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs and publications, please visit www.jeserie.org and like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Reverend Jeffrey Brown, thank you so much for joining me for this discussion.
Good to see you again, and thank you for having me.
So Reverend Brown, if we can, let's begin in Boston. I mentioned in the intro the astounding 79% reduction of violent crime amongst Boston's youth over 8 years. But there's another number that's important to the understanding of the Boston Miracle. That's 29. A long span of months without a single youth-involved homicide. That all started because you started walking the streets between 9 or 10 o'clock in the evening up to 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, which eventually led to clergy being the go-through for youth to police. Tell us about that.
Well, it was something that I never planned to do. It's something that I plunged into as a result of homicides that I was presiding over, funerals that I was presiding over as a result of homicide. So it's one thing to do funerals of 70, 80-year-old people who have lived a long life, and you have a lot to say. It's another thing to do a funeral of a 16-year-old or 17-year-old. And sitting in the back of my church would be, or a funeral home would be, the youth who were their friends and their plans to go out to retaliate. There was nothing that I could say to stop that. And then, you know, when 2 people got killed not too far from my church, and found out that one of them was running in the direction of the church and died some 100, 150 yards away, I realized that there was nobody at the church if they would have gotten there. And there was a message in that for me, and that was in all of the preaching that I was doing about community, that there was a segment of my community that I was excluding out of my definition of community. And so if I wanted the community I was preaching for, I had to reach out to them. They weren't coming to church. They weren't out during the day. They were out at night. So I had to come out of the 4 walls of my sanctuary and meet the youth where they were. And so as a result of that, there were a few clergy doing very similar work that I was doing. An incident occurred in Boston that brought us all together. And then we started walking collectively in arguably the most dangerous neighborhood in the city at the time, trying to make connections, build relationships, learning how to listen and not preach, to be able to understand our neighborhoods after 9 p.m. at night, you know, between 9 p.m. and 5 a.m. And as a result of that, we were able to come up with some pretty innovative ideas because we stopped looking at the youth as the problem to be solved, and we started to see them as some of the most creative and intelligent, insightful people that we've met. And so the combination of our knowledge and their knowledge was able to put together a plan, and put a coalition around that plan, And we started to build partnerships, and it was bottom up. It wasn't, meetings with the police commissioner and then command staff and then the district captains on down. But it was with the gang unit officers who were out there when we were out there. And when they realized that they had community leaders who saw what they had to deal with on a nightly basis. And when we saw police officers, a lot of them who grew up in the community, they were trying to make their community better. Then we saw an opportunity for, a real kind of synergy of trying to bring peace to a community in the difficulties of society that we were facing. So, and then it sort of spread from there. People talk about the miracle as just being the clergy and the police and the youth, but it was really everybody. It was probation officers, it was city and community agencies, it was the community mothers that sit in the housing developments to watch the kids, it was the basketball coach or football coach, the YMCA director. It was street workers who were employed by the city who played a critical role in all of that. It was everybody, what I would call traditionally conflicting constituencies coming together for a cause that was much bigger than them, but together we could make it happen.
Well, I have to think that some of those initial conversations, or just the initial thought to take to the streets and begin walking, might at the very least seem uncomfortable. And just recently in January in Plymouth, Massachusetts, at a Martin Luther King Jr. breakfast and unity celebration, you said, if he was able to see what was happening today, I believe Dr. King would urge us to be maladjusted, because change does not come from comfortable living. We change by being uncomfortable about how things are and the need to see a vision of how things could be. You saw that vision and you've seen it happen over time now. And you mentioned that just awful moment of a youth running toward your church that is closed, that was shot in front of that. Tell us about your sense of community discomfort and how to work through that and getting people to actually come to the proverbial table or the literal table together. How did that work for you?
Right. Well, it worked in the realization, first off, that doing the same things the same old way was not going to change anything. And I tried that. I tried preaching sermons decrying violence. I tried building programs in my church for at-risk youth. It would get a few folks, but not the people who really needed that we needed to really connect with. So no matter how hard I preach, and I don't think I'm a bad preacher, I think I'm a pretty good preacher, it just didn't work. And so being able to do something unconventional for the sake of trying to find answers that eluded us, that was beyond us, was really important. And being able to talk to youth who, as I heard somebody else say, was close to the pain, but also close to the answers, became really important. And it was uncomfortable. I mean, it's a very violent period of time in our city. There was a lot of random violence that was happening, people who would get shot, even though they weren't even involved in the situation. And so for a lot of us, we had to always look with another eye to see, what else was going on, because you just didn't know. We had a leadership structure of 4 leaders in our organization, and that was intentional. I mean, we did that because we realized that when a leader gets killed, sometimes a movement gets destroyed as a result. So if we had 4 targets, then, the movement could continue if something happened to one of us. And then those uncomfortable conversations. I mean, for me as a pastor, it was really important for me to hear the perspective of the church from the standpoint of the youth that I was talking to. And for many of us, we think evangelism is this triumphal kind of, we've got this great gift that we're going to impart upon you. But when you go out into the streets, you find a lot of people who've been hurt by the church, who've been rejected by the church, who've been mistreated by church members. And so our approach had to be different from the usual comfortable approach that people would make around, connecting with people spiritually. So, but in having those uncomfortable conversations, I grew a lot as a person. I began to see, the situation out on the street as not being separate from my own context, that there was really no separation between the streets in my neighborhood. They're all one. And so if that's the case, then, you really get to what I would call the heart of the biblical message. And that is to reach the least, the lost, and the left out. And the only way you can rise is that we rise together. And so uncomfortable conversations, yes, because they reveal blind sides, if you will, to your own approach, to your own personality, to your situation. But there are also opportunities for tremendous growth and tremendous insight.
Well, I think one of the things that continues to stand out to me as I continue to go back and watch that TED Talk that I mentioned is that, you start by acknowledging you wanted to be the pastor of a mega church. And, the whole, as you put it, the whole 9 yards, you
Yeah.
want, 15, 20,000 people, a clothing line and all of that. But you dug in and stayed. You stayed in
Yeah.
Boston because, as you put it in that talk, somebody had to.
Yeah.
And you've been a conversation starter. One of the things that Dr. Paris Baker wrote in a recent report for the Jefferson, I just want to quote from him: "For various reasons, Americans ardently avoid or resist race-related conversations." He wrote that in a Pain-Filled Polarized America report he put out. And I asked this question to him when we were talking about that for a program. And I'd like to ask it to you I framed it, this is arguably one of the most important and one of the longest unaddressed dialogues. You've been working to address it in history. Why couldn't we bring ourselves to talk about it fully before? And why is now, 2020, it feels different? It feels different than the 80s. It feels different than the 60s. Historians and observers are noting that. Why is now, 2020, a potentially as transforming as the Civil War era in the 1960s civil rights movement?
Yeah.
Why now?
It's really an extraordinary time that we're living in. And I don't think that it happened just in 2020, but it's been building over years. I think you can see it within my own context. We had this extraordinary reduction in violence, 79%, 29-month period of zero juvenile homicides. But that's not the end of the story. The continuation of the story was that the violence came back and it rose again to a dangerous level around 2005, 2006. And then, it's a trite phrase, but the band got back together again. And we started looking for newer and more innovative ways to approach this situation. We managed to build those relationships with new people because the streets change all the time. And we began to get it down again. But that's when I began to see the cyclical nature that goes around this issue of cultural violence. So when you talk about the structural weaknesses like failed housing policies over decades and chronic underemployment as well as unemployment in inner cities, poor educational institutions, and lack of strong educational emphasis. When you talk about poor health care, and in the midst of all of that, you throw in guns, you throw in drugs, then you have this cultural violence that continues to foment. And so our work with youth was important, but it was only one step. If we want the cycle to be broken, then we have to address those structural issues. And I think that's what's been building over the years. When I was in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, after the death of Michael Brown, I was with hundreds of clergy in October of that year, standing with the youth of Ferguson as they continued to protest the injustices that we were having. And I really looked at myself as being a part of this, that this was a continuation of the work that we've been doing. We've got to be able to deal with those structural issues, and it's not incumbent upon the Black community itself to do that. In order to deal with the structural issues, we need everybody. And I think there has been, over those past 5 years, a realization from the larger society that we have to do this collectively, that we have to do it together. After the death of George Floyd in Boston, we had several marches. One of them drew 55,000 people to Franklin Park. And I was a part of it. I'm there at the staging area and I'm looking at this sea of people. It was one of the most diverse crowds that I had ever seen, at this type of a march. I mean, everybody was there. And, mostly younger people, which was really encouraging for me. I would have been discouraged if I saw a lot of white-haired people, there. But there was these young people, and they were all coming together saying, we've got to do something. We've got to figure out what to do. And so I think that, the blessing of the tragedy of George Floyd is that it sparked something within, our society, and particularly the younger people of the society, that something must be done.
So you mentioned housing, education, economic opportunity, and you mentioned George Floyd. In 8 minutes and 46 seconds, that's the time that Derek Chauvin knelt on George Floyd's neck, and he died after 8 minutes and 46 seconds, as the nation is now watching that. And Chauvin has since been charged, with the murder of Floyd's death. But those 8 minutes and 46 seconds have led to a nationwide of protests and marches, as you pointed out, a call for police reform, including defunding the police. And that's a call we're hearing here in Erie, Pennsylvania. From your experience and observation, we have momentum behind this movement. What policy changes have the deepest impacts most quickly? What do you see that works? What if cities and governments are going to start right now? If it's not one day, it's day one. What do they get started with?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of folks who are focusing in on the law enforcement component of this, and they're talking about defunding the police. There are a few people who are talking about abolishing the police department. I'm not one of those who advocate for that, but I do understand why we need to redirect police funding, out of the police department and into more of the community efforts that really are part of the law enforcement effort, public safety effort, if you will, but have always been woefully underfunded. In a lot of the communities that I've worked in, there are a lot of folks who've got the will and they've got the drive to do this, but it is time consuming and it is labor intensive, and people need support. And folks are tired of begging for that support in order to make a difference in their community. And you have police departments who have ballooned since the 80s as a result of a public safety effort in a city. But much of that ballooning has been focused on, inner city communities and communities of color to the detriment of those who are actually making a difference and want to see more of the structural issues dealt with. And, a lot of police departments, when they do their budget hearings, they talk about the violence that's happening and their need for more money in order to deal with it. When it's clear, at least from my point of view, that if there was more of a solid partnership with the community, that that would be a cost-effective way of dealing with it. In Boston, we've got overtime budgets of like $60 million, and I've got folks who would say to me, if I just had $1 million of that $60 million in my community, there's so much that could be done where we would not have to be heavy on law enforcement. And so we're not talking about enormous amounts of money, but we are talking about significant contributions. And police departments do not have to spend exorbitant amounts of money trying to figure out bigger and more sophisticated surveillance, machinery, for their inner city efforts. But if they just plug into some of these groups who are willing to put their shoulders to the plow, they would have a much greater impact and a much better difference.
What I hear there is what I heard you say earlier was when you took to the streets as preachers, you listened instead
Yeah,
of preaching. And I think that's maybe an easy step one that I hear out of that. And maybe
yeah,
it's easier said than done, but I hear that clearly. And I hear, investing in public safety in different ways. One of the questions that has come in from the audience, I think right in this topic, the person is acknowledging some of the challenges we've had in Erie, from police force in schools to we've recently seen an officer fired from the Erie Police Department for sending a racist email. To other challenges we have, this person just puts it bluntly: what's the prescription for peace that you see would work in our community? So if you're prescribing us peace, what does it look like?
I would say, do not look at this as solely a law enforcement issue. This is not about law enforcement. Law enforcement is just the arm of the structure that the society is currently in. And that structure has to change. I mean, the wonderful thing about the Obama administration is that he demanded evidence-based, work that people can see from a social science point of view as being, prescriptions to some of the ills in our society. And there is a ton of evidence-based work that points towards, some kind of reordering, some kind of redirecting of what's happening in our cities in order to benefit everybody within the city. And so if it was a prescription, I would say, you have to work on these larger society issues like disparities in healthcare. You have to work on the educational disparities. You have to work on the housing disparities. When we talk about redlining and the shape of communities and how they came into being, you just can't undo that by offering a program and not being able to support the community as they, take on that program. There are folks who look at, housing prescriptions now, but because the structure is the way that it is, it's almost impossible for communities of colors or families of colors to be able to take advantage of those things. So you have to think big at this point. This is one of those moments where doing things the way that it's been done will not work. And yes, there'll be resistance. I mean, people change when the cost of not changing becomes too great. What my prayer is that it doesn't become so great that, that there'll be violent, upheavals, as a result. We've got a lot of decent people, throughout our nation who are able to say, all right, let's make this work somehow. And they can come up with the creative ideas to do it.
So again, the disparities you mentioned between education to housing to redlining to the economy, the
Yeah,
other virus that we're facing as a nation, as a world right now, other than racism, is COVID-19. And it's
yeah,
difficult to ignore
yeah,
the novel coronavirus in context of this discussion because it has a disproportionate effect on the African American community. Take Erie, for instance, as the Erie Times News reported on June 25th, Black residents represent 35% of the positive COVID-19 cases, but make up only 7% of the county's overall population.
mhm,
Erie, though, isn't an anomaly in this.
yeah.
This disparity is nationwide. For those who just say to you, I don't get it, what do
Mhm.
you tell them and what needs to be done immediately?
I tell them that, all of the structural issues that I've outlined before, positions people of color to be susceptible to, this coronavirus. I remember, people that I know who, were talking about the hospitals and the folks that were going in and how the beds were filling up and the deaths that were occurring. And then there were people who were getting sick. The folks who clean the hospital rooms, after, someone passes or someone leaves the room. And they are as much first responders as the police or the physicians or anyone else. And those jobs are usually held by people of color. When we talk about the nursing homes and those folks who've been affected by the COVID, a lot of your nursing home workers are people of color. And so we are positioned because of the economy and how it affects, large cities and communities. We're positioned to be more susceptible to this virus. But the interesting thing about COVID is that it knows no race, it knows no socioeconomic strata. It will hit you no matter who you are. And if you look at the current numbers, the fear is that it's going to get worse again before it gets better again. And that evokes a concerted response from everybody. So for me, the COVID virus is also an indicator of the times that we live in, that we've got to come together and not in a piecemeal way. I mean, one of the things that distressed me was that, you've had state to state responses, for this. And so, I found myself not being able to travel to different states because of what was happening, within their states. But if there was a more universal, more collective response to this, I think the nation would have fared a lot better. And so, for me, what people need to get is that we are in a moment where the interconnectedness of peoples and neighborhoods and families, it can't be more prominent, and it can't be more, front stage. You can see it within the healthcare system. You can see it within the social systems. You can see it everywhere. And so we have to learn that lesson and do something about it.
So, Reverend Brown, when someone responds to Black Lives Matter with the phrase "All lives matter," what do you say?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. They'll ask me a question. Well, don't all lives matter? I'm like, yeah, but I usually answer it in a biblical context because I am a minister, and so and I usually say, it's not a matter of one versus the other. It's a matter of perspective and understanding what's being thrust with that. If you look in the Bible, in the Gospel of Luke, in the 15th chapter, there's this parable of the sheep. 100 sheep, and one sheep goes astray, and shepherd goes looking for that sheep. You can imagine the 99 saying, well, don't our lives matter? But they're not in trouble. The one sheep is in trouble. And so, for that context, that sheep lives matter. That whole series of parables of the lost coin and the lost sheep and the prodigal son was in the context of Jesus talking to a group of people. Half of them were Pharisees and the other half were publicans and, what they would call sinners and all of that. And the more Jesus talked, the more the Pharisees moved away, and the more the least and the lost and the left out moved closer to him. And those who were in close range with God, the Pharisees, were complaining about that. And and Jesus answered it so many different times. I mean, he said, look, I'm not here to, for the healthy, I'm here for the sick. And that's what you should be concentrating on too. So it's not about your life because you're feeling left out, but it's about when those who are in trouble, when those are in danger, when those who are threatened are in trouble, we all need to focus on that and not just on our own, And we've got to learn how to live life more sacrificially, understanding that, if we're all right, if those who are in the most trouble are all right, then all boats get lifted. And as a nation, we're having trouble learning that lesson, and so I'm hoping that we will.
For that, I can't help but think that perhaps it's the American rugged individualism that
Yep.
plays into our mythos that is the trouble of that, of, from, thinking selfishly and individually about oneself, whether it's, in context of the Black Lives Matter movement or even down to wearing a mask. I don't
Yep.
want my liberty and freedom taken away. How do we advance that conversation with somebody who's dug in, somebody whose
Yeah.
heels are planted, and say, but what about me? I matter too. And what about me? I don't want you taking my liberty and freedom from me. How do you, Reverend Brown, go about that?
Yeah, I usually tell them that the Bible doesn't support that. I mean, people look at the Protestant work ethic or the American dream, and they say, this is what this nation is all about. But if you think morally and if you think ethically, we're all tied together, as Dr. King would say, in a single garment of destiny. So our problem is that this individualism has led to these enormous gaps between peoples, the haves and the have-nots, the rich and the poor, the advantaged and the disadvantaged. And that is not how this society was built. I mean, you had folks who came over, they were in trouble, in their native land, and they came together because they realized they had to come together. Now, they did not realize that, coming together meant, bringing everybody, up to speed. And for African Americans, it has been, literally hundreds of years of suffering, as a result of that. But that's the ideal. And the quicker we understand that, that we're neighbor to one another, and that neighborliness is what gives us the strength to be community, the better off we'll be.
So, Reverend Brown, I'm so grateful for the time you're spending with us. You talked about, getting the band together and doing amazing work in Boston. And then when the call rose again, getting the band back together. Thank you for playing the Erie stage and bringing this message to us. I got to say, we need a nationwide tour from your band now more than ever. Your voice is fantastic. I just have one final parting question before we stop here. And that's, I said, for those with their heels stuck, those who can't move, and you had a great answer to that. So those who have come unstuck and want to be part of the solution, to people who reach out to you and say, Reverend Brown, I want to help, but I don't know where to start.
Yeah.
What do you tell them?
Yeah. I usually tell them that there are people in your communities whose voices you have not heard. There are folks that are mobilizing it. And I've seen this in every city, in groups that I've talked to, and I've talked to quite a number over the past 2 weeks. But there are people who are coming together in some very powerful and important ways. And some of those voices are angry. Some of those voices are hurt, but they all need to be heard. And so, there are larger organizations that people can get involved with. There's an organization called The Color of Change that is a great organization. There's Project Zero, which is another organization. But I would prefer people looking locally and working locally with groups. There are faith groups that are thinking about, how we make this change. There are youth groups that are out there that are emerging. To be able to listen and to understand, I think, is the first step to take. And then, for your community, it's about, how do we make this happen in a meaningful way that will evoke the change that we seek. And that's the way to be the change. And, it's not going to be easy. You can't find simple solutions, for this. It's going to be complex, but it's the kind of complexity, if you work on it, that really builds community. And at the end of the day, you'll find yourself and you'll find your neighborhoods in a much better place. It's going to take a while, and there's going to be some ups and downs, but I believe we can get there. I have hope that we do.
Reverend Jeffrey Brown, thank you so much for taking the time to join us
Yep.
for this Jefferson program today. And for
Absolutely.
all of you watching along at home, thank you for tuning in. And for those watching a later broadcast, we appreciate you tuning in as well. Reverend Brown, for those looking to connect with you and follow along to witness the work you're doing, where should we point people?
You can always catch me on Twitter. It's recap, RECAP _INTL. That's recap _INTL. You can always catch me there. Got a website, revjeffreybrown.com. Can tell you about what I'm doing. There's a whole lot of stuff that's going on all over the place, and you can also reach out to me, and if you have any conversation that you want to have with me, I'm happy to do that.
Reverend Brown, thank you. And of course, for more information, folks, on both past as well as upcoming Jefferson programming, as well as publications, please do visit our website, www.jeserie.org. And be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Speggen. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us today.